Jeff, let's speak a little bit about authority in the church from a definite perspective, that is the role of the theologians. You and I sort of think of ourselves as theologians. At least we go to the conference of Catholic Theological Society of America, and we try to keep up with things, and we have degrees, that sort of thing that we usually associate with professional theologians. So I think we talk about this topic from the inside in a way. The role of theology in the church, and we're linking it with this question of authority now. You want to say anything about just what it feels like to try to function as a theologian in the church, and look at that a little bit from the inside? Of course, you're the chair of a department, and that sort of slants part of it.
I appreciated your not disclaimer at the beginning there. I mean, I think of myself as a theologian, but I recognize that at any given moment there may be a few theologians in the world. I think everybody does theology on a popular level, but there are people who are folks of great authority, the Ronners and the Skillebecks and the von Balthasars and people like that. There are some preeminent theologians across the world to whom I listen. It's an exciting thing to do this kind of work, and it's a real privilege, I have to say, to be able to do this kind of work.
Yes, and I think that's the way I would see myself as well. I mean, there's theologians and there's theologians. I mean, there are the great theologians to begin with who have shaped things like Karl Rahner and Yves Congar and Bernard Lonergan, and then there are other theologians who are of influence, people like Avery Dulles or Richard McBride or Richard McCormick. And then there are other sort of the working theologians who are teaching classes, undergraduate courses, and maybe some graduate seminars now and then. And there's really quite a difference. I mean, there's some who are making very creative contributions, and there's many of us who are trying to popularize that or get it into, help people to see it in some digestible form, some form that they can understand.
That's exactly how I see my task as a popularizer, as an interpreter. As someone who can help people make a connection between their experience and their own faith and what these larger syntheses look like, precisely so that they can think in a more organized sort of way, in a more explicit sort of way. And that often turns lights on for them, and then they can move from one thing to the next and make connections with other things that they know. As people become more educated, it's important that they believe in more sophisticated, or express their belief in more sophisticated sort of ways, so that religion doesn't become this little pocket of superstition in the back of their head that they memorized when they were very small.
Well said, and that then gives a sense of importance or significance to the kind of work that we try to do, as not as well-known theologians, but as people who are trying to make it real to people at their real level, where they're functioning in their everyday life. And I agree with you. I think that's an important task, and I think people often appreciate that if it's done well and actually helps them. Let's. One of the things about your own training in theology is that it's very historically oriented, isn't it? Why don't you just say a little bit about that, about how you study theology from an historical perspective?
It, as an historical approach or a historical approach, recognizes that we always believe in ways that go along with our time and place. And so I guess this first struck me a number of years ago. I met a man from Japan who was a catechumen, and he said, God is one. Whereas in the West we probably would say there is one God. The difference doesn't seem monumental, but he's tied to his time and place. Mm-hmm. And so Christian belief develops historically and culturally, and so it's always helpful to me, and I was talking with a friend who's in grad school recently, when a question comes up of theological importance, I think it's important to look back into the tradition and see what's there. Paul Tillich years ago said the difference between Europeans and Americans is that when a question comes up, a European will say, what's already been said about this? What's already been done here? What can I learn from the ages? Where he says, the American says, what do I think about this?
Yes. So we're always sort of pushing to get more of an historical view into the questions of theology, and we probably can try to do that with this question at hand here, because we're talking about authority in the church and the role of the theologians in that. Now, whenever this starts, we always go back to the scriptures themselves, and within the New Testament we see a role for the teachers, don't we? There was an explicit charism of teaching, and and already within the New Testament itself we find theological reflection. That's why Paul's writings have different slants than John's writings, or the synoptic gospels look quite different than John's gospel. So we have different theologies already existing within the New Testament, but we also have the explicit recognition that the teachers have a charism. That is, they are gifted by the Spirit to do something for the well-being of the whole church.
When we go through those texts sometimes in a class, once a student pointed out, she said, look how high, in Corinthians, where they talk about the various gifts, she says, isn't this wonderful? Look how high the teachers are here. I say, this is a very old book. I don't know if that's operative anymore. But teachers did hold a very important place
in the New Testament. And as a matter of fact, we could say that the church has always had a sense of the importance of the theologians. Now that was has to be understood in historical context again, because in the early church, usually the bishops were the great theologians. The jobs went together for many centuries, so that Augustine is not only the most important theologian, most influential one, but he was a tremendous bishop. So he combined those kind of roles.
Yeah, I'd say it in precisely that way, that some of the very best theologians became bishops. It wasn't simply that you became a bishop and then became a great theologian. Ambrose is the example of that, but he's sticks out like a sore thumb in most cases, because someone was a very good theologian and understood the belief of the people and could announce that to them in a helpful way. That's the person who became the bishop.
Right, and so there was a combination of these roles, and then we looked at many of those people and we called some of them the fathers of the church. And then we call other ones the doctors of the church, like Thomas Aquinas would be a doctor of the church. That is, the church, in other words, officially recognizing that these people played an important role in the development of Christianity. We would even have those titles for them.
Yeah, it's important to translate the term. The word doctor in Latin means teacher. Mm-hmm. It's the person, and occasionally you run into this, you're a PhD, well, you're not a real doctor. Say, no, we're the real doctors, we're the teachers. Yes. And frankly, real physicians are the people that do teach you and help you to take good care of yourself. I mean, that's where the title fits
That's
together.
Right, it does go together again, yeah. Oh, when you want to say anything about the fathers of the church here, we often distinguish out the Eastern fathers and the Western fathers in thinking about this, because the theologians in the East have really did have different slants on all that. If you look at the great schools of Antioch and at Alexandria, we have Cyril of Alexandria, and then we have the great Origen, who died in 254. And these Eastern fathers of the church, that is, the ones who sort of spawned the theological creativity in the church, really saw the church in distinctive ways. They understood God and God's transcendence and the way God's energies came to us. And I suppose most distinctively, they understood that we were divinized by God's self-communication to us, that we are really changed, transformed. We are sparks of the deity, as Basil said, and we have almost become God. They almost go that far in this idea that the Spirit comes upon us and changes us. We call that uncreated grace. But anyway, we had a sort of distinctive kind of theology done in the East, fathers like Origen and Alexandria, and Cyril of Alexandria. But then in the West, dominated by Augustine, we have a sort of different sense, more influenced by the Roman Empire, the legalities of it, the juridical approaches, and so on.
I think what's crucial here about talking about the fathers is the necessity of them doing theology. I mean, you talked about the content of what they did, and I'm thinking more about why they did what they did, and that was that as Christianity moves into new times and new cultural situations, they had to find a way to say the gospel and explain what it means in ways that would speak to that time and place. And again, as you say, we talk about the fathers of the church, and we don't have mothers of the church per se. So that's often a problematic term.
We do have women doctors.
We do. There's Teresa of Avila and Catherine of Siena. Right. But I also think of Macrina, who is the sister of at least two of the Cappadocian fathers, if you remember Basil and the two Gregories. In fact, Basil, the great, wonderful theologian, only became that because his sister Macrina taught him how to be. And the other brother, Gregory, always talked about her as the teacher. She was the theologian. She was the one who made something out of those two guys. who made such a big difference to us in terms of the development of the doctrine of the Trinity, for example.
A point of history, Jeff, that very few people know.
Little known facts.
Macrina. Yes. And in the same family, sisters to those two well-known people. And her name almost erased from history, I would say, from the history of theology.
It's only because of the attestation of her brothers that how wonderful she was, probably, that we have a good handle at all on who she is, because a lot of her stuff does not survive.
Let's date Macrina.
This is late 4th century.
Oh.
The Cappadocian Fathers developed in the West the notion of three persons in one God, the language to say that for the Council of Constantinople in 381. So it's middle 4th century. 350, 360.
Very good. And they themselves attest to the power of their sister Macrina.
She was the theologian.
Wonderful.
She was the theologian.
So we've got this role of the theologian here, and we get it identified in large measure with the bishops. But then we begin to get another kind of movement in the role of the bishops, and that is the establishment of the cathedral schools, and you end up with getting sort of a separate guild almost of theologians. We're in a feudal period, and these people are set aside. They become now university professors eventually. University of Paris, very important. That's where Meister Eckhart taught, and Thomas Aquinas. And so now we begin to get a different sense of the theologians. They're now not the people who become the bishops, because the popular vote are not, you don't have so much of a democratic procedure in picking these bishops. They become more identified with the secular world. They become more chosen more often for administrative type abilities. But we've got these other people in the universities who become the real theologians, a guild of people charged with understanding the faith, explaining it, finding ways to make it real for the people.
These were the good old days of theologians, when theologians were a real big deal. They were, you did your undergraduate work in the universities in the Middle Ages so that you could go on perhaps to one of the graduate programs in law or medicine or theology. And theology, of course, was the queen of all of the sciences. Bonaventure understood that all of the sciences led us to theology in some way or another. And it was recognized that these people were magistri. They were masters. There was a magisterium that they enjoyed. It was an academic magisterium, and when bishops had questions, they went to these magistri. They went to them to ask them, how do I solve this? What's the point here? What do we want to say? And it was recognized that didn't inhere in the bishops so much as in the talents and the training of these masters.
Can we look just a little bit more at the development of the cathedral schools idea, and then the development of the universities and so on? Can we say a little more about that?
It grows out. We have to remember late the 4th and 5th centuries, the barbarian invasions begin, and culture goes underground in Western Europe.
Largely preserved in the monasteries.
Yes.
Benedictine monasteries.
As Joseph Pieper pointed out, culture is a function of leisure. If the Huns are coming through your backyard and you're grabbing your family and running out the front door, you don't have time to sit down and do theology and write songs and do literature. I mean, it's just not in the realm of the possible. So that all goes underground. But the monasteries store and copy the manuscripts. And so there's kind of a two-pronged thing that happens here. As we get toward the early Middle Ages, with the decline, the end of the barbarian invasions, we start to see the cathedral schools developed and the monastic schools. The texts come out of the monastic schools. That's where the skills and the word has been preserved, and they begin to flower in the early Middle Ages. And we see these cathedral schools, as you mentioned. And eventually they form corporations of students and scholars together, students and professors, that have authority that comes sometimes from the Pope to charter these universities, that they're freestanding corporations and they can't be messed with by any other authority on the planet because they have academic freedom. And it's precisely the papacy in many cases that guarantees that academic freedom and makes this stuff possible. There's
an interesting interplay between the papacy and the theologians, because I think very often what happened then with the development of the universities and these the magisterium of the theologians is that you got intense debates. You got schools of thought and different outlooks and so on. And I think at least part of the dynamic was that these various schools of thought were afraid the other one would prevail and overcome them, and they would go out of existence. And part of the role of the papacy then was seen as a protective device. The Pope was to protect the situation so that there could be freedom and that one group wouldn't sort of overcome the other totally.
a real protection of pluralism. That the Franciscan school that was so angry with the Dominicans and Aquinas for using Aristotle. You know, you're supposed to use Plato and Augustine. You're not supposed to use the stuff that we got from the Muslims, for God's sake. And Aquinas was condemned in a number of places. In Paris and Oxford, his books were burned because he's using this funny philosophy. The papacy intervenes and says, you know, there's plural. You can have different schools of thought. There are different ways to say what God's doing in our midst. Some are more adequate and some are less adequate. But when you're talking about mystery, to take it down to a point where it's so literal that only one way of talking about it is acceptable is really problematic, I think, theologically.
Right, and so we get this odd thing from our perspective today, at least, where we are worried about the papacy often being a centralizing force and just enshrining one theology in its documents. That's sort of the liberal cry in relationship to Rome today. Look back historically into the medieval period and in the 13th century and so on, and you see the papacy, at least to some degree, keeping alive the debates and recognizing pluralism.
That there are possibilities, there are ways, different ways to say what God's doing with us and for us that are both adequate but very different.
We think of the 13th century as being a great time of the theologians, Aquinas and Bonaventure living in exactly the same period, two of the greatest theologians in the history of the church, different outlooks, Dominican and Franciscan, different approaches to how you do theology. They represent sort of a high point, I suppose, in the history of theology. And I think many people would say then after that period, when we got into nominalism and so on, that we're hard put to find really great theologians after that. Theology is often thought of as going downhill from then on. And very often I think people would say, well, the theologians became simply yes men for the papacy. They didn't have creative thoughts. They just went back and rethought Aquinas or redid Aquinas or copied him or imitated him, maybe is a better word. And then the other rap at the theologians, the things they didn't do right, was that they became house theologians. They simply did whatever Rome wanted them to do without thinking creatively or recognizing their own charisms.
It's what happens when people are not connected to the University of Scholars anymore. That's where their commitment is. They become committed to this or that point of view, and then things begin to break down. Your point's well taken. In the 14th century, it is a time of theological decline because people didn't do what Thomas and Bonaventure did. They said what Thomas and Bonaventure said. They discussed what they had said. They didn't continue the project, blinded by their bright light. Some other commentators have said that in the 14th century, we see the bubonic plague move into Western Europe, and there's some speculation that the people that would be doing the theology, some of the best and the brightest, were people because of their hearts were out taking care of the sick. And so we really had the B team. The junior varsity was doing theology in the 14th century. The best and the brightest were not. They were taking care of people in crisis.
The person who sticks out in my mind is someone who wanted to think more creatively in the 19th century, jumping ahead, but I think you almost have to jump ahead because I don't see major names really in there. That are all of that significant, but would be John Henry Newman, who began to see the importance of the role of the laity and really entered into dialogue with the modern world because he saw the development of doctrine and so on, and did theology as you like it in a much more historical fashion. Newman learned theology not so much in a Roman Catholic seminary, didn't learn it in a Roman Catholic seminary, he learned it as an Anglican, and he learned much of it from the historical perspective which interested him as he taught at Oxford. And thus going back into the history of things, he really looked at it from very different perspectives and thus became a creative force. In other words, he wasn't just repeating what Aquinas said, he was actually thinking about what the faith meant in the 19th century in England.
He does the best of what historical theology is about, puts us in touch with our roots, not simply repeating formulae, things that have been said before, but what did it mean to those people? And then there's a process of translation. If it meant that for them, how can we say that today in a way that's faithful to the meaning, if not always to the words?
When we jump ahead to the 20th century, then we get, I think, a parallel to the 13th century, where we get two giants existing at the same time, born the same year, 1904, dying the same year, 1984, studying together in Rome and going in parallel directions and doing their theology, and that's the great German Jesuit Karl Rahner and the Canadian Jesuit Bernard Lonergan. two giants who have really influenced theology, who again did things creatively and who began to rethink what the faith is all about. And so we've got now jumping all the way from Aquinas and then Newman and then up to these giants, I think, gives one a feel for the vacuum that existed for so long and the great importance of these theological giants of our own time. I feel lucky to live in this time. I think the whole church benefits from what these great creative thinkers have done.
I find myself, as you make the point, they were born in the same year, studied in Rome. I want to know who those people were that were their teachers. We always look at Thomas Aquinas and say he's wonderful, and it's because Albert the Great was so wonderful.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting, I think, about that, Jeff, is they had to rise above their times. What happened with Rahner is he went to the seminary, as Lonergan did too, and they learned the standard manualist theology, as we call it. I mean, they were told to study Aquinas in the same patterned ways. But their genius lies in they personally rose above it, so that Rahner studied the Belgium Jesuit Joseph Marichal and began to think more creatively for himself. In fact, his own doctoral dissertation, which had to be written on Aquinas, that's important for people to realize, that Catholic theologians had, since in the 20th century, had to write their doctoral dissertations on one person, Thomas Aquinas. And his doctoral dissertation was not accepted because he used too much modern thought, borrowed too much from Immanuel Kant and tinges of Martin Heidegger. So his teacher really rejected his dissertation, this great theologian. So I see it not so much that they had a teacher, but that they were creative geniuses themselves and had the ability to rise above their circumstances and realize if they were going to make theology pastorally relevant, preachable, important for the people, that they had to think in new ways.
And that's a wonderful point, that this is not merely academic theology. This isn't idle conversation among academics. This is, for Rahner especially, if it's not pastorally applicable, if it isn't something that's going to take us into helping people, it's not good, it's not worthwhile.
Exactly. So what we've done, I guess, rehearses a bit of this history of the way theology is developed, but we're trying to see it in terms of this question of authority, aren't we? And we've said there's been a magisterium of theologians. In fact, a point that back in the medieval period, early modern period, I think the theologians actually functioned as the schools functioned as sort of setting the dogma almost, or setting the official teaching. They had a real role that way. Now, theologians today are in a different posture. They're in a collaborative kind of approach. Excuse me, we could take Second Vatican Council as an example here and say what happened there is the bishops gathered in 1962, but when they got there was all this theological work that had been done ahead of time preparing documents. But then while they were in Rome, they kept interacting with the theologians. They would ask them to give talks. Rahner went all over Rome constantly giving talks to the bishops. And other great theologians did the same thing. So you got an interplay going on here between the official teachers, the bishops, and these informal teachers, unofficial teachers that we call the theologians. Now, the strength of the theologians was, would their arguments hold? Would their historical perspectives be helpful? Would the way they presented it look pastorally relevant? So they have a different kind of authority. The bishops have an authority that comes from their office. Because they are in this position, they have a certain authority. But the theologian's authority comes from the fact of whether they're good or not, whether they're in touch with the Scriptures, the questions of the times, and are able to mediate between the Christian tradition and the real questions of this era.
The point you make about Vatican II is important, that sometimes the dichotomy is made today, the situation, do we follow the bishops or the theologians? Who's in charge here? And it's never really a question of bishops or theologians. It's a question of which theologians are the bishops going to use. You alluded a few minutes ago about Vatican documents today coming out, and they mirror certain theologies in certain directions. They've opted for one particular group and for one mindset there, and that's okay. That's what the hierarchy is supposed to do as we enter this collaborative mode. The question is, then, is all pluralism to cease? I mean, is it to say that there aren't other ways where we can say this and other ways to explore this? That's when things get problematic.
That's right. And then that's where we go back to our historical model, when the papacy actually kept the field open for theologians and understood that the pluralism between Franciscans and Dominicans, for example, was healthy in the church. It seems to me that becomes a model for how it might work today. But the theologians must work by persuasion, right? They have to come up with good arguments. They must organize their material. They must draw on the Scriptures, look at the history of questions, present it in an intelligible and credible way. Then it becomes credible not only to the bishops, but to the laity as well. They have a mediating role.
As you were saying that, that's what I was thinking. You know, I think maybe some people would think, well, the theologians got to do all this research so they can be credible to the bishops. I have to do that so I'm credible to my students, that I have cogent, coherent arguments, ways of presenting information that help them to make sense of their own experience. And if I don't do that, it's thrown away. I have no effect.
You have no authority.
I have no authority. That's very well stated.
That's
exactly.
Right. You lose all your authority because your authority is not really ultimately based on the fact that you're the chairperson of the department or you're assigned to teach this course. In any real sense, your authority comes from whether what you say is credible and intelligible and illumines people's lives and is faithful to the tradition. That's where the real authority comes, and that's what's different about the bishops and the theologians in all of this.
It's a very good... more and more bishops I know are studying and doing a lot of work in theology. Some are professional theologians. Some are. Many are not. I was very moved by our own bishop. He was at our place for dedication of a building, and in his talk he said, I would like to have some time so that I could go and study theology.
Jeff, he has a wonderful feeling. In fact, I just wrote him a letter not long ago. I heard him give a talk at the 25th anniversary of the priest gathering, and it was really fine theologically because it was reflection on his own experience while the gospel functions in his life, and it was a wonderful witness to the priests. I applauded him for that. And bishops, as you said, don't have time to study theology today for the most part. I mean, they can't be professional theologians usually, unless they were before they became bishops. And they have to rely on the theologians for guidance. But it's a good example of how we have to put this all together. Jeff, we've been on authority in the church, role of the theologians. And what we're saying is that they work by persuasion. They must be in touch with the Scriptures and find ways to make it real and relevant for people today.